Okay, so I'm shifting gears a little bit, although some of what I'll talk about I think touches on some of the earlier conversation in response to Matt's, some of what Matt had to say. And something I've done a lot over the years is really to use genetics as a tool to understand environmental influences and try to, often when I say environmental influences, I mean influences within the family, because full disclosure, I'm a developmental psychologist. And if you look at developmental research until fairly recently, or depending on your perspective currently, you would think that parenting is a pure environmental measure because the studies are of one mother with one child, and the inferences are that what she does influences the child via the environment. Genotype environment correlation was mentioned earlier as a problem, and typically when we, in behavioral genetics anyway, talk about genotype environment correlation, three types of GE correlation are described: passive, evocative, or active. And passive GE correlation simply is the result of sharing genes with the parent who rears you, and therefore your genes are confounded with the environment you experience. Evocative is that the environment or the people in it, again in the type of work I do, are responding to genetically influenced characteristics in the individual. So people with more difficult personalities are going to have different relationships with other people than people who are more easygoing. It's kind of obvious, but I will argue it's important to distinguish that. And active is when individuals seek out environments that are correlated with their genotype. And since most of my work is focused on parenting, in the data I present today will also focus on parenting for the most part, we can't really distinguish evocative from active because children don't choose their parents, although they may choose situations that they experience with their parents. However, it's a little too subtle to distinguish without the use of a planned experimental design. And I like this figure for illustrating how we think about GE correlation in the context of parenting. And this is from a figure that Jay Belsky presented in a paper in the 80s on origins determinants, he called it, of parenting, where the parents' characteristics influence how they parent, as do the child's, and then the context, such as the marriage, also influence how the parent parents. And to the extent to which a parent's genes influence their characteristics, which subsequently influence the way they parent, that's an example of passive GE correlation. While evocative GE correlation is illustrated by the extent to which child's genes influence their characteristics, which elicit different types of parenting. And parents' personality can also, of course, have an influence on lots of other things like their psychopathology, the amount of social support, their relationship with their partner, which here is illustrated only as, I think the laser is weak, or I'm pointing in the wrong place, it's too weak. Anyway, which is illustrated here as only influencing their parenting, but marital relationships also, of course, have a direct influence on the child's outcome and functioning. So, one strategy that we've used, there are a lot of ways to try to look at GE correlation, and we've done, you can make inferences about GE correlation simply by estimating genetic and environmental influences on so-called environmental measures like parenting or marital relationships for that matter. When you do that, you're limited in the way you can interpret your findings. So one way to try to better understand the processes involved in GE correlation is to use more extended type approaches, like children of twins design. And this is a conceptual model, but I think it works reasonably well. So in a typical twin study, and in this case the twins are parents, MZ twins share all of their genes and DZ twins share half on average. But when you also include the child, a child inherits exactly half their genes from each of their parents, and we also have the spouse here. They're not used in this model, but they can be incorporated. And the children of MZ twins are as similar as children as half-siblings. They share approximately 25% of their genes, and children of DZ twins are like any other cousin pairs. They share 12.5% of their genes. But the interesting piece of this is that is in the relationship between the child with their twins, with their parents' co-twin, right? So a child of an MZ twin shares half their genes with their aunt or their uncle, which gives you some unique purchase on distinguishing genetic effects from environmental effects, especially in the context of family environment. This was not quite enough for us because we wanted to draw these pretty pictures, but really it's because we wanted to be able to better estimate the evocative genotype environment effects. This is the twin parent sample, which is the children of twins approach that I showed before. And the twin parent sample is very good at estimating passive GE correlation because you've got parents' genes influencing the way they parent. Also pretty good at estimating direct environmental effects, but it's not very good for estimating evocative genotype environment effects. And that's because you have limited genetic variation in the children, right? Your maximum genetic similarity of the cousin pairs is 25%. So if you add a sample of twins who are children that you also have parenting data on, you then maximize your ability to estimate the evocative GE correlation because the children now vary in the full range from 1 to, when you include also the cousin pairs, 12.5%. Of course, in the children who are twins sample, this is the same parent, and it could be drawn otherwise, but you can't get a sense of how we estimate these differential effects. So for estimating evocative GE correlation, this N path would be significant, right? Because it's the child's behavior, in this case, adjustment, influencing the way their parents parent them. Passive GE correlation is indicated by the M path in conjunction with the A1 prime path. And this A1 prime are the genes that the child shares with their parent that are correlated with the parent's parenting and with the child's behavior. If this is 0 and this path is significant, then direct environmental effects are indicated. So through this kind of extended children of twins model, you can really begin to understand what's happening for a variety of parenting constructs and child outcomes. And so right now, the catch with this is, of course, it's a little bit complicated, or difficult is more accurate, to collect a sample of twins who are parents who have a co-twin with a child within X number of years of the co-twin's child, which we do, within 4 years. Also has a spouse that have been cohabitating for 5 years or more. I mean, etc. You add all these constraints and it becomes a difficult sample and you have to go to Sweden, which is fine. I like my Swedish colleagues. And we've published now 3 papers using this approach, using a couple of different matched children who are twin samples. And in our first 3 published papers, we have again and again found evidence for evocative genotype environment correlation effects. This is very interesting, actually, and not that surprising. These are adolescent samples. There's a fairly wide age range in these 3 samples. And this figure is actually for the first one. But we've looked at a couple of different constructs, as you can see. Maternal over-involvement linked with adolescent internalizing problems, evocative. Parental criticism and adolescent externalizing problems, evocative GE correlation for mothers, but for fathers, we see direct environmental influences. So there is some difference there. And then the third study used a different sample. It used a matched adolescent sample of twins and siblings of varying degrees of relatedness from the US. Looked at parental negativity and adolescent externalizing, and again found evocative GE correlation, and this was both for mothers and fathers. So we started to wonder, is this model just kind of loaded to find evocative effects, which would be kind of disappointing given the amount of work that went into it. So we went out looking. we looked for constructs that we thought were going to be less likely to show evocative RGE, and we found them, and they were kind of obvious. So for parental monitoring and adolescent externalizing, we find no evidence of GE correlation at all. There are direct environmental influences such that parents monitor and externalizing behaviors are less, and it's environmentally mediated. And the same is true for parental criticism and adolescent somatic symptoms. And it's worth pointing out for these two direct environmental effect findings, the child samples are different. So it's not a sample-based design. It's always the same parents who are twins sample, because that's the hard one. I have lots of time. I went way too fast already.
You're doing it backwards. No,
Okay, I'll let you two work it out.
no, it's just he's correct.
Oh, okay, very good. Okay, so what the one problem or challenge, limitation, I guess, of the extended children of twins model that we've been using so far is that we haven't, you can't really say which came first, right? Because they're all cross-sectional. So being a developmental psychologist, we wanted to extend this longitudinally, and we're not yet funded to do this, but we're working on getting an application in June. And we sort of struggled about how we could do it, and then we thought, why, Peter Molinar is at Penn State, and he likes to spend his weekends trying to make sure that these models will actually work. And we were right. So Peter developed this model for us. This is the full model without the error terms and all of that, but it's extending it to 2 times. And this is a straightforward longitudinal model where we would simply estimate evocative or passive or direct environmental effects at each time for children. And in this case, we originally were thinking that we were going to look at children at age 5 and age 7 because we had a nice matched sample at those ages. But we've since thought about trying to do another piece that would be a staggered longitudinal design. Peter doesn't know this yet, where we would look at kids at age 3 when you might expect that, at least for some aspects of parenting and child outcome, that the effects would be more passive GE correlation or direct environmental, and you might see a nice transition to more evocative effects as the children get older. And this is really the model that we're interested in. This is now just 1/2 of the twin pairs, so that we're interested in the potential cross-lagged effects and understanding how these GE correlation processes may unfold differently over time. So that's the end of the twin stuff for now. Another approach that I've been using in some of my work that I think is really important to think about when you're interested in trying to distinguish genetic and environmental influences in novel ways, I think that you need to use multiple strategies. And most studies, twin studies, are typical, biological parent-child designs, right? So genetic influences are provided to the child from the birth mother and father, prenatal influences via the birth mother, shared environmental influences. So these are all entangled. With twin studies, you can tease them apart a bit because you have multiple children. But in a typical developmental study, you can't tease them apart at all. When you use an adoption parent-child design, you can then begin to better disentangle at least genetic and prenatal effects from shared environmental effects. Because when a child is placed at or near birth, the only influence of the birth parent on the child is genetic, again, or in the case of the birth mother, prenatal. And the effects of the adoptive parents on the child have to be via the environment, or shared environment, if you want to use the ACE terminology. And we've used this design for a lot of things. Actually, we've found GE correlation all over the place when we didn't expect to find it, but that's not what I'm talking about today. We also find evidence for evocative GE correlation using this adoption design approach. And here are some findings. I think I have them highlighted. We find a direct effect of birth mother ADHD symptoms on child impulsivity. Child impulsivity at age 4.5. Birth mother's average age is around 21 across the sample, but it ranges from 14 to 45. So birth mothers are extremely diverse. We also see an influence of the child's impulsivity on their mother's hostility, which then is linked to the child's outcomes, and of course is indirectly linked via the child's impulsivity to hostility and also to the child's outcomes, which indicates evocative GE correlation, right? Because this link, there could also be prenatal. We controlled for prenatal risk factors here, so although there could be some things that we didn't control for, we can think about this as a reasonable proxy for a genetic estimate.
So you control for maternal smoking prenatally there?
I couldn't hear anything you
Maternal
said.
smoking prenatally.
Smoking prenatally is controlled for here. Yeah. I could talk to you about smoking prenatal, but I took those slides out because I didn't think I had enough time. Yeah, it is controlled for here, though. And we don't see a direct effect of smoking during pregnancy and ADHD in children in any case, at least at these early ages. Whoops. We do see an influence of smoking during pregnancy on trajectory of externalizing behavior in children from age 18 months to 27 months, but only when we use marital hostility as a moderator. So when marriages are not hostile, easygoing, no effect of smoking during pregnancy on the trajectory of externalizing problems up to age 4.5. But when there's hostility in the marriage, we see the effect.
So why have the arrows two ways? I mean, double-headed, like this child impulsivity and during mother hostility? And that could be joint, right?
It could certainly be a reciprocal effect, yes.
Right. So how do you, I mean, so why, I thought that's kind of the essence of what evocative might mean. So they're involved in an interaction with each other, and they would simultaneously evoke hostility. They might have a phenotype, they might have a genotype. And so I'm not quite sure how you're identifying. That goes back to Steve's point earlier today about how, maybe you have thought about that. Or
well, the reason it's drawn this way is it's sort of a theoretical decision in the steps of the model building for this particular paper. So it's certainly possible that it could be a reciprocal effect with parental hostility impacting child impulsivity. But since they're both assessed at the same time, you kind of have to make a decision about a directional arrow. And they could certainly be mutually influencing one another. So I guess calling it a prediction is probably not accurate, or, you know, it's not necessarily a predictor to an outcome. Now I have 0 minutes, but that's okay. We're trying to deal with that in some ways through some of our observational data where we have some microsocial coding, and a former student of mine is working on really teasing apart the direction of effects between child aggression and parent intrusiveness in these microsocial second-by-second interactions. But in terms of the way these things are measured at the same time with parent reports, it's less possible, I think, to get at the reciprocal effects in a way that is useful.
I'm just saying you could have reversed the arrow.
We could certainly have reversed
So
the arrow.
The curious thing would be, if you don't reverse the arrow, how much does your story change if I use the reverse version of that and just play with, you know, the alternative arrows here?
Right. Well, I mean, we can certainly look at that. I don't know the answer to that off the top of my head, but there's no reason not to play with it a bit more. In this case, I'll just do this quickly because I am out of time. I know, I'm sorry. We have the toddler, the variables are measured at different ages of the child. So toddler inattention is at age 18 months. Mother and father hostility are ages 4.5, and preschool disruptive behavior is also at age 4.5 actually. And we again see evocative GE correlations here. So the birth mother characteristics are influencing the toddler's inattention, as well as are related to mother's hostility toward the child, and father's hostility to the child, which then impact the way the child interacts with his or her peers. I can end there. Have questions?
Thank you.
Oh, yeah.